I felt sorry for them, because, in their apparent determination to be like male soldiers, not one was worthy of second glance, and sadly, they seemed not to know that they were a crude byproduct of the Hitler Youth, Labour conscription, and the Nazi programme of moulding them to fit the image of the ideal girl of the Third Reich. This sterile indoctrination had robbed many of them of all female attraction, something we had encountered less amongst Russian girls. Curiously, about the same time, I came upon an article in the SS Black Corps magazine, complaining of how today's young men and women seem to have little interest in each other. It stated that it appeared now more prevalent for young soldiers to eschew all decent, hard-working girls and instead marry a shallow, flighty, superficial woman. My impressions of the university clinic were first the cheerful assistance of the nuns, and second the sheer joy of a hot bath, which was followed by more medical examinations. On good days I was able to walk into town, which took me back to 1939, when, accompanied by fellow officers from Stettin, I had first explored the city of Munich. Later, when confined to bed and feeling a bit low, Patricia suddenly appeared. After that, I started to make rapid recovery with only a few minor setbacks. On September 1st, they transferred me to the Neurological Institute into the care of Dr. Baumüller, who had previously worked under Professor Ranko in the former sanatorium. In the meantime, Patricia had to return to Wangeritz for 10 days because Frau von Bismarck was ailing. On the night of her return from Wangeritz, there was a heavy air raid which seemed to be aimed at the district of Sendling, with many bombs in equal weight falling around the Sollen sanatorium and the centre of the city. I think it was Munich's first big air raid. Surrounded by dust, smoke and ashes, men, women and even children worked with extraordinary calmness to clear away the debris. For someone coming from the front, it was an unforgettable image, and I was struck for the first time by just how much our civilian population had to endure, and reckoned it was almost in equal measure to that of the men at the front. At the same time, the high degree of efficiency and skill of the rescue organisations came to the fore, be they from the party or from the air raid services. Because all traffic had come to a halt, I borrowed a bike and cycled towards the main station and came upon Patricia standing at a bus stop. Placing her suitcase on the bike, we walked back to the Soln sanatorium, which had miraculously survived. That same day, I found a charming room in a little country hotel, which was to become our little haven when I was not needed for treatment at the hospital. At the end of 8 weeks, I was finally discharged. During that same period, Patricia and I had spent many a night in the cellar of the Solna Country Hotel, and on the 7th of October, during a second air raid, we got to know the owners, who proved to be kind and accommodating people for whom one had only admiration. The many hours around the light of flickering candles, listening to the innocent chatter of children, seeing the brave and always cheerful landlady and the other interesting characters will forever remain indelibly printed in memory. Despite the raids, we had opportunities to attend concerts and plays in the German Museum Concert Hall, including symphonies by Beethoven and Brahms, conducted by Furtwängler and Oswald Kabasta. On the stage, we saw pieces by Halber and Sudermann, including Youth, Tromulus, and The Battle of the Butt Turflies. I remember feeling as if I were outside, looking in through a window onto a magical summer landscape, which brought back poignant memories of my school years, and the emphasis on expanding one's intellect. I was bitterly reminded how narrow the life of a soldier at war is, and how much to discover there will be in the years ahead. During my first few weeks, I saw a strong and vibrant Munich, but now I was witnessing a wounded city which now clearly exposed its two sides. It happened to have been the time of the brother and sister Scholl tragedy. On the one hand, among the populace, there was deep resentment against the authorities for pronouncing a death sentence, while on the other, much to the amazement of those returning from the front, there was immense courage, steely resilience, and a general coming together in the face of the increasing attacks from the air. Similar descriptions were given to the Londoners during the Blitz, and is more proof that it is almost impossible to bomb a determined nation into submission. Also, the Scholl brother and sister were two university students who belonged to a resistance group called the White Rose, and who openly criticised the Nazi government. They, along with many others, were executed. Patricia and I took a long weekend vacation at a convalescent home in Greinau, just below the Zugspitze, and following another 14 days of leave in Wangeritz, we returned to the Army Reserve Depot at Traunstein. I was permitted to spend Christmas at home. However, no sooner was Christmas over than I experienced a succession of dizziness attacks caused by lack of much-needed medicine prescribed to combat this frightful condition, which, I was told, was the result of a damaged inner ear. During the month of January and most of February, Patricia and I stayed at a hotel in Traunstein where we enjoyed several wonderful weeks together. Whereas during the day I worked with an Army Reserve battalion conducting manoeuvres, holding lectures and assembling equipment. In our free time we took extended walks around Traunstein and climbed the hills above Ruhpolding. While this was going on, there was also an unsettling period of back and forth involving work with the reserve unit and speculation about an appointment to another battle command. Without my knowing it, a decision had been made at the beginning of January, declaring me fit for frontline duty, and at mid-month a telex was received ordering me to report to Army Group Centre as battalion commander. An order was an order, but Patricia was convinced that I was far from fit, and she said that instead of commanding a battalion, I was likely be relegated somewhere to be a country station master. She insisted I pay another visit to Dr. Baumüller, who immediately declared me unfit for duty, a decision which naturally caused great dissatisfaction to those at Army Reserve headquarters, whose job it was to follow up meticulously on all orders. The outcome, however, was 2 more days of detailed examination in an observation hospital, all of which duly confirmed Dr. Baumüller's prognosis. About this time, I travelled back to Munich and reported to the adjutant at General Army Command and asked for a battalion that was not about to be immediately thrown into battle. I felt I needed additional time to work my way back into the flow of things. The response, however, was a phone call asking if I would be prepared to go to Romania as a training officer, an offer I gladly accepted if just to get away from the grinding homeland bureaucracy. On the 18th of February 1944, I received orders to join the German military mission in Romania, and on the 22nd my express train pulled out of Traunstein still under a blanket of deep frost, leaving me with a parting view from the train of many smoking chimneys and shrouded rooftops. The days and weeks spent with Patricia, our many walks and special events both big and small had made Traunstein into a cherished new place in our hearts, one of many we had together in Germany. Salzburg lay under a deep winter haze, however the change in scenery was everywhere. Not only were the buildings with their much-loved yellow and brown colouring different, but also the architectural style, station names, and even the appearance of the people, all of which reminded me of my days in Karlsbad, Prague and Troppau. Due to an air raid on Stuttgart, all trains were running late, and whereas my train was to arrive at 1 a.m. between Wels and Linz, there had been another air raid alarm, and there followed another long wait until around 2 a.m. high above the cloud cover, we could clearly hear the sound of aircraft engines and the exploding flak. When the train was finally in motion again, we entered a valley containing the tiny station of Leonding, Hitler's hometown, and the place where his parents are buried. On his daily walk to school in Linz, he would have climbed the crest of a hill bisected by the steep railway cutting through which our train now travelled. Deep snow still covered the Semmering, which looked down over picture-book valleys. The train glided past the once glittering Schönbrunn Palace and onto the station at Vienna East, where I was forced to wait until midnight in a greasy second-class waiting room. At first light, the train reached the outskirts of Budapest, where I observed in silent amusement how Hungarian officers strutted back and forth on the station platform, dressed either in their traditional khaki or in blue, but all with their high-peaked hats reminiscent of the old Habsburg army. Once across the Romanian border, the landscape began to change again, and with the approach of the Siebenberger Highlands, I once again saw little towns and villages with attractive churches and tidy little houses. Sadly, because it was dark, I missed the most beautiful stretch, and it was not light again until Kronstadt, today's Brasov. The express train travelled faster than expected through the mountains rising up beside the line, and almost towered over us until they eventually slipped away to the west, leaving us to cross an almost desert-like region, with low-lying shrubbery and stunted trees. In the vicinity of Campina, I caught a glimpse of the distant oil fields in the Carpathian foothills. Then we came upon the industry, oil refineries, rubber factories, and the main oil fields of Ploesti and its protective smokescreen making plant. About an hour later, The train pulled into Bucharest, following which the small travelling group in our compartment quickly scattered. The approach to the northern railway station in city of Bucharest reminded me of many gritty towns in eastern Poland, although the impression changed sharply the closer we came to the centre of town, where there were tall, modern office buildings. Surrounding the King's Palace stood shops, government offices and theatres, all built in a grey and white super-modern American style, and in between were low-slung villas, each with a front garden ringed by a metal fence. I was reminded of parts of Paris and London, particularly of the latter when viewing the palace guard, who it appeared were attired and trained to resemble those outside Buckingham Palace. My first thought was to ask myself if I could show these guardsmen to Patricia, but on second thought I decided it was not a good idea, for they lacked the same spit and polish and the precise arm and hand movements. She would have been disappointed. That same afternoon, I reported to the second in command at the German military mission, a Lieutenant Colonel Weishar, whose offices were in the Romanian War Academy, from where he had an uninterrupted view out over the rooftop haze of the city. The impressive location of the academy and the respect it commanded would have been difficult to match, even with a tasteful, modern edifice erected in some western city, although I was vaguely reminded of the Maria Theresa War School in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower in Paris, with its motto, "Be more than you appear." Perhaps one day we shall see in Berlin a similarly highly regarded General Staff Academy. At midday on the next day, I had to report to the Chief of Staff, Colonel von Scheven, who, while explaining the present situation and the terms of our assignment, described how the Romanians, through no fault of their own, had lost all their heavy equipment at Stalingrad. He said it had been madness to assign an 80-kilometre stretch of front to a single Romanian division. Following that, I introduced myself to General Hansen, head of the military mission, who filled me in from behind his desk. He declared how the Romanian cavalry had it right, when instead of making all noblemen into cavalry officers, they tried to make all cavalry officers into noblemen. The general spiced his remarks with amusing little tales, and unlike Colonel von Tresco, who would barely deign to speak to an unknown infantry major such as myself, treated me with old worldly courtesy. Those few minutes with the general will belong to some of my most memorable encounters. He possessed big blue eyes and a straight but prominent nose, and his Knight's Cross sparkled brightly beside the lilac blue of his Mihai Viteazu medal. Although not up close, I was to see the general again some 3 weeks later, when he held a long lecture in front of a group of Bucharest training officers. He spoke fluently, with intelligence and without notes, and his comments inferred that responsibility for the present failure of Romanian arms lay in the deficiency of the officer corps, both Romanian and German. His remarks gave me much food for thought as I headed north to the infantry training establishment in Fogarash, run by Colonel Bohem. The colonel was tall, slender, and quick of movement, with an open, weather-beaten face in which I detected both energy and yet a youthful laissez-faire. As for me, as a pale-faced newcomer with my short yet precise replies, I must have given the impression of utterly inscrutability, whose qualifications would have to be thoroughly tested, which was no doubt accomplished by having me hold frequent sandbox attack manoeuvres. As far as I could tell, the German training mission for officers and NCOs was spread out over a number of army schools throughout the country. A few of the furthermost schools lay in Dorogoi, east of Kernowitz, in Galați Ineu to the northeast of Arad, and in Turnu Severin. In Fogarash itself, besides 2 training commands, we had a guard company which was usually, either in whole or in part, available for training demonstrations. With the arrival of spring, I succeeded in getting to know a little of the people of Fogarash and the somewhat unattractive town, with its munitions factory and 17th-century castle built much along the lines of the French military engineer Vauban. With my initial assignment fulfilled, and having the feeling of having accomplished something of value in Fogarash, I sat contentedly beside the driver as the vehicle ate up the dusty miles on our way back to Bucharest. In the back, both asleep, sat Captain Emmerich and Captain Batu, the Romanian liaison officer. It was unusually warm, and dark, heavy clouds hung oppressively overhead. Here and there our headlights reflected against a white house wall, a tidy veranda, or a closed barn door. The village signs were often in German, but all was in darkness except for the lights at the railway level crossing. Was it really only been 3 weeks since I first arrived in Fogarash? My arrival must have been during that same early hour, except it had been cold outside, and sleep had been impossible because no one could tell me when we were scheduled to reach Fogarash. When, at 4 a.m., the train finally pulled into the tiny station, there was only one horse-drawn buggy for half-dozen dark figures descending onto the platform, all in search of a ride into the town some 2 kilometres distant. Nonetheless, with skill and patience, the coachman succeeded in stowing all of our luggage, and we were off at a trot. The skinny nag appeared to know only 2 gears, a trot or a gallop. It was growing light when we finally passed through a number of sentry posts and reached the clerk's office of the German unit. The clerks, who to my astonishment had slept on the floor, were only just climbing out from under their blankets, while outside the walls echoed to the sounds of Romanian troops assembling for morning parade. That was how my stay in Fogarash had begun. The small town was home to a Romanian infantry training depot complete with a firing range, an NCO school and a garrison battalion. The German mission in the country also included a Luftwaffe element and was set up so that each weapons service had a German-led instructor. The training officers were under the command of Colonel Boheim, a tall, elegant, snow-haired man with a white moustache that matched his ice-blue eyes. The 2 officers in charge of the German training units were Major von Vogel and Captain Emmerich. The former reminded me of a pre-1914 officer principally because of his erect bearing, his thin blonde moustache and a pair of twinkling big blue eyes. He was of medium build and had a wooden hand from an injury incurred earlier in the war. It took me only a few days to learn who I was working with, and in the broadest of senses they were first-class officers of a kind no longer often encountered in this the 5th year of the war. First Lieutenant Botha was one officer who brought back many memories of the Donets front. He had been ordnance officer under Colonel Eberding, who at the time was commander of Infantry Regiment 53. From his comments I recalled the colonel's lisping, uniquely dry sense of humour and his penetrating steel-blue eyes. Colonel Eberding later became divisional commander, but was transferred to the west where it was said he had been killed, which however was far from the truth because he actually came to visit us when we were living at Bridgefoot in England. First Lieutenant Botha was also an extraordinary character and was in my opinion an above-average officer. He had a doctorate in languages, was always full of life and energy, and never let himself be unduly influenced by age-old military customs, hierarchy and rank. Stories abounded about him right across the country, one of which was about the time General Hansen met a tall, young officer in the home of a consul. It should be noted that German officers were forbidden all contact with foreigners and diplomatic personnel. On this occasion, First Lieutenant Botha snapped to attention, saluted, and remarked cheerfully how he was aware of this restriction, but felt that to every rule there had to be an exception. His disarming charm won the day even in the presence of his highest superior officer. Then there was the tireless figure of the adjutant First Lieutenant Botcher, who, having worked there for 4 uninterrupted years, seemed to have become part of the Fogarash landscape. He knew everyone, and everyone knew this corpulent man of whom it was said, if only he would put aside his strict service demeanour and tell us his stories. I had come to discover the terrain around Fogarash through Romanian troop exercises, and had discovered a bit about the mentality of our host population. The single most important manoeuvre ended with a tank-supported assault on a certain village some 5 kilometres south of town, and, in accordance with Romanian regulations, all those killed were to remain where they fell. Never has a military regulation been followed with more enthusiasm. As prescribed by the referees, the men lay where they fell, in the yards, alone or together, hanging over fences or out of windows, and refused to move until the referees signalled the end of the exercise. The villagers were delighted to play their part, and always greeted the men with a wave. A Romanian officer told me that the Romanian elite Iron Guard unit had drawn many of its recruits from villages around Fogarash. Yet another small piece of the mosaic of my 3 weeks in Fogarash was the feast to mark the 1st of March, which is the day of fertility, and much like the Rossian Sakuska, begins with small appetizers served on wooden platters to which came the Zuika drink, or a stronger plum schnapps. Women outnumbered the men and were usually short and dark, although among them was the occasional blonde, blue-eyed with dark hair. Of note was their elegance and graceful movement, which may have been made more noticeable because most of us were no longer accustomed to being in a world surrounded by women. I was also amazed by the complete lack of formality, and, had I asked to be formally introduced to my dinner companion, I would have been looked upon with incredulity. A highlight of the evening were the many speeches beginning with the Romanian base commander, who was viewed as a difficult man, because he had the tendency to agree to every recommendation and then do exactly as he pleased. He spoke free of notes in a lively, fluent style, and no sooner had he expressed a wish for our final victory, he proceeded to enumerate how many times over the course of history his poor Romania had been cheated and betrayed. Colonel Bohem's reply was no easy feat. However, he pulled it off by expressing in his closing remarks a fervent wishes for a happier future for Romania and its people. How often would that wish be repeated in the coming months, and how often were they to speak of lost provinces under the Soviet yoke? No one, Romanian or German, was then able to imagine how forthcoming events would unfold and what conditions would prevail in the years ahead. As fate would have it, my only view of Kronstadt, now Brasov, was to be through the light of headlamps and a late moon, and yet that was sufficient to gain an unforgettable impression of its extraordinary character. Waiting for my train, I sat in a near-empty waiting room where the waiters still wore tails, and as if by magic produced culinary delights all quite unlike those found in gloomy, overcrowded German railway stations. It was there where I was reminded of a conversation I had had with a Romanian officer of German descent. We had talked of politics and of the German people as a whole. The man's name was Kirschner, and he had a 20-year-old son in the Romanian army. His attitude towards me was at first reserved until one evening the ice was broken. I am no longer sure what it was, but it might have been our having to share a meal from the same pot. Anyway, at that point, he began to unburden himself going back to 1933 when Germans everywhere were witnessing the first rays of a newfound confidence and a nationalistic coming together. It was soon noticed, however, that the youth were gradually becoming more and more radicalized and were systematically pushing aside the older members of the German-Romanian community, with the result that cocky, immature youths were occupying leading positions and, in their zeal for modern National Socialism, were treating their grey-haired elders like children. The upshot was that decent folk began to distance themselves from the German community, bringing about a deep split between the young and the wiser older citizens. This youth movement, he said, had begun even before the outbreak of war, and had since only become more pronounced. From this man's remarks, it was clear that the unwelcome influences from the Reich had deliberately set about imbuing young Romanian Germans with a deep and troubling fanaticism. It appeared that he and his family had suffered as a consequence, and no doubt, like many others of his generation, were de-emphasizing their German heritage and were now concentrating on fulfilling their duties as good Romanian citizens. The train to Bucharest was filled to overflow, and we, confined to the corridors, stared out into a countryside illuminated by the moon. Between the mountain pass and the town of Sinaja, we passed by a brightly lit barrack complex where 43 American POWs were being held. These were airmen who had been shot down during an attack on the oil fields of Ploiești. It was widely reported that they were generally quite happy with their level of treatment. No sooner had we left the Ploiești oil refineries and the ugly town behind than everyone in our crammed compartment made ready to leave the train. Romanian staff officers in their as-signed compartments awoke from their peaceful slumber. Doors were flung open and baggage passed out. Those standing in the corridors had to make themselves thin, although all was marked by a mood of genial cooperation and good humour not always found in military circles. Even an innocent flirt with an elegant young woman who got on board with an older man in Kronstadt, and who had to put up with overflowing corridors, had to come to an end. She was a charming young thing, and I thought it was kind of her to cheer up one of so many foreign soldiers in her land. When on the platform we bid each other goodbye, I was left silently marvelling how even in this grim, merciless war there were still moments of warmth and cheer for an old soldier. What struck me about Bucharest was the abundance of food, especially baked goods and sweets seen in the windows of the wonderful confectionaries, and shops selling cosmetics were as tastefully decorated as any in Bond Street. I'm sure all would seem fantastic to Patricia. Were she here including the never-ending stream of large American model automobiles and the elegantly dressed afternoon crowds of men and women on the pavements? That just about completes my comparison with our sober and sombre Germany, a land since 1940 with empty shop windows, worthless coin, and the absence of anything that might make our lives a little better. Small wonder that some German officers have defied army regulations for it. Requires an almost superhuman effort to ignore how people here laughingly pursue their daily pleasures. For most Romanians, this war seems to be no more than an annoying inconvenience to be sorted by the Germans, the English or the Americans without making life too uncomfortable. I find it hard to understand why there is no common European alliance against the Bolsheviks, although such a notion, I fear, exists at the moment only on paper in the German propaganda ministry. Unless British and American soldiers come and provide a bulwark against the hordes from the east, there can only be one outcome which will then surely spell the end of all easygoing existence in this country. The more I give the whole matter sober thought, the more I think the outcome will be the latter, but who dares think about the end of tradition and culture? I continue to be filled with a profound hope and wishful thinking, for even contemplating the alternative would make life an utter torture. I am off to the city of Radna to take command of Training Detachment 119. Radna is easily found on the map, for it lies at the mouth of the river Mureș, or Maros in Romanian, on the plains 20 kilometers east of Arad, the first town of any size inside the frontier. On the evening of March 3, 1944, I was greeted by warm sunshine as I made my way onto the station platform. At about 5 p.m., while formalities were being completed, I had an opportunity to look around. German soldiers in badly worn or shiny new grey uniforms lay or sat on their baggage and stared in disbelief at things long since not seen at home, such as attractive, well-dressed women, cigarettes, chocolate, white bread, fruit and nuts, none of which were within their grasp for lack of local currency. I silently prayed the train's departure might not be delayed so that these poor devils might escape the torture of not being able to enjoy the riches of this magical land, and be quickly returned to the sober reality of the homeland. The train, when it did pull in, was comfortably empty, and between the capital and Ploiești, a blue-green dusk sank over the flat land. The air was warm and small specks of coal dust flew in through the half-open window. Nothing, however, disturbed us because my fellow passengers and I were already engaged in a deep discussion. The man seated opposite had just returned from Odessa, which was about to be abandoned to the enemy. He knew the Russians only as Bolsheviks, had fought in the Crimea, and described in a few short, bitter sentences what had taken place there. His words were deeply troubling, and proved yet again how weak our forces were, and how irresponsibly misleading Berlin's propaganda was. He spoke of the failure of our naval units to come to the rescue of our troops trapped on land when they could have been evacuated by water. What he said sounded terribly true, and when reflecting back on the first bitter Russian winter, I knew that the terrible price for our faltering leadership was being paid in blood by our magnificent, self-sacrificing frontline troops. A special thought was given to the impending fate of the local Crimean population, who, like few others, had warmly welcomed us Germans, but who now faced a merciless eradication. Things simply could not go on like this. Since July of the previous year, the entire front had been in retreat, and our losses were of nightmarish proportions. Someone in the compartment asked how long it would be before Berlin drew the right political conclusion and finally acknowledges our overall inability to halt the enemy. There followed a deep silence as each of us withdrew into his own private thoughts. I was reminded of an unhappy premonition I had as far back as 1942, in which I reckoned that a man like Hitler would see my village of Wangeritz and all others like it in Upper Pomerania reduced to ashes rather than admit failure as leader. Thinking back to my convalescence leave, following a 3-month hospital stay, I had entered the hotel salon where I overheard the latest radio news from Berlin, which was quickly followed by bombastic speeches about the heroic battle being waged in Stalingrad, just at a time when the dreadful situation there was growing steadily worse. Even if my impression at the time had been wrong, I knew we needed strong, resolute and intelligent people in government who refused to put up with the present insanity. Surely there was some way to come to terms with the West and let the Allies decide the fate of Germany rather than lose all of Eastern Europe to communism. While each of us in that train compartment was sunk in his own thoughts, darkness fell, and since switching a light on was not permitted, the conversation gradually drifted into silence. On March 10, 1944, I received the following letter from my former adjutant, Lieutenant Targa, which paints a vivid picture of the brutal reality of war. Dear Major, I don't know where or even if these lines will find you. Thank you for the letter with your Christmas greetings. Unfortunately, I was kept very busy at the time, and often all I could do was put a letter aside until time was found to read it and reply. Now I find I have plenty of time to make up for my failure to reply more promptly. From the 2nd of March on, I find myself in hospital suffering from a thigh wound. Luckily, the bullet passed right through without touching the bone, although you can believe me when I say no longer give a damn. Of all the reconstruction work undertaken during our days on the Donets, absolutely nothing remains, but let me start from the beginning. Colonel Eberding, who, following your departure, was promoted to general, left us before Christmas. It was said he did not agree with his commanding general, but now is supposedly in command of a regiment in the West. His replacement, a man from Dresden, has also long since returned home, and the many upper echelon changes have led to a general breakdown in leadership both morally and physically. The pluckier a new regimental commander is, the quicker he is gone either dead or wounded. You have asked about many of your former colleagues and how they are faring. Of all the mates in the battalion when you were in command, Sergeant Moore is perhaps the last, otherwise it is all new faces. Moore still holds his defence position and has proven himself to be a man of rare quality. He was, after all, always quiet and not easily ruffled, and at times altogether too calm, especially when working as battalion clerk. His level-headedness and acute awareness helped him survive these past few terrible weeks. He truly never faltered even when the battalion HQ itself had to be defended in close combat. He succeeded in concealing our maps, papers and documents by trampling them quickly into the mud. It was during this last episode when I got my bullet, and up until then we had been a sort of fire brigade to be sent anywhere the enemy threatened. On the 24th of February, we were just north of Czernowitz, when that same night we were encircled, and it was only through the sudden descent of thick fog that we managed to make good our escape, albeit with further casualties. During a similar event, some 2 weeks before we lost Muller and Stepanek, both of whom were signalmen of irreplaceable quality. Their telephone centre suffered a direct hit from a T-34 tank that had pulled up outside the defence position. Muller was killed instantly while Stepanek died on his way to the hospital. Moments later that same T-34 was put out of action by an 18-year-old replacement using a Panzerfaust. Dr. Behrens and all the first aid men were made prisoners, and your always cheerful Batman Batka is missing, although it was rumoured he was wounded and had to be left behind. Sergeant Hartling is dead. He was shot through the heel, and knowing that in waist-deep snow he would be an unbearable burden for 4 stretcher-bearers, he rejected evacuation and instead took his own life. Things are just as bad at company level where First Lieutenant Vernwer, Lieutenant Anders and Lieutenant Weller were all wounded and shipped home. Vernwer lost a leg. Lieutenant von Einsiedel, the last commander of the 1st Company, was killed shortly before I myself was evacuated. Things are much the same in the other battalions, and they even finally got the old Rusky killer, Lieutenant Colonel Ellerbeck. In the early morning fog, they broke through the front line and attacked the regimental command post, and no one survived. Despite these difficult days, life goes on without these greatly trusted, much-loved comrades. However, one has the feeling that life is but a slender thread that must soon snap. Wherever you are and in whatever circumstances, I wish you and your wife all the very best from the bottom of my heart, and would dearly like to hear your news. Signed, your old adjutant Targa. The despair in this letter is impossible to miss, and also the reality that by this stage the German soldier on the Russian front was no longer fighting for some political notion, but simply for each other and survival. Saturday was a bitter cold day with swirling snow. Shortly before midday, I received an invitation from the training school commander to dine with a number of officers who were about to be transferred. The meal was scheduled for 1 p.m. in the officers' mess, so I rushed off to get changed. The officer mess was on the ground floor of what had once been a hotel, standing near one end of the lip of our bridge. We officers assembled in a Spartan anteroom before Colonel Mardarescu arrived, following which we all took our seats at the dining room table. The meal began with the usual appetizer consisting of small slices of bread, garnished with egg, fish and meat served on wooden skewers. This was followed by a thick paprika soup and the main course of meat and potatoes boiled in cabbage leaves. To drink, we were offered a local beverage called zuika, plum schnapps and watered-down wine. Colonel Mardarescu made a long speech praising the departing officers, including a battalion commander, following which there was a general poking of good fun at the many curious habits of military bureaucracy. The colonel went along with this irreverence for a while, and I can still see his white, rather long, drooping moustache, which gave him a foch-like appearance. In stark contrast to the hair on his head, which was snow-white, his eyebrows were dark, and his friendly eyes even darker. He possessed a narrow, straight nose, which gave his lively face the suggestion of a cunning old fox. Despite the difference in languages, the conversation flowed freely, especially since our first Lieutenant Stormer spoke fluent Romanian and Lieutenants Sturz and von Kietzel were among a group of friends and colleagues, with whom they were in touch almost every day. Once the commander and his staff had left, we Germans remained behind, and a more relaxed and informal mood was set by us 3 battalion commanders, giving us an excellent opportunity to get to know our fellow officers a little better. The celebration went on until 5 p.m., at which time 4 of us rose to our feet and departed, leaving others slumped over the table to sleep off their overindulgence, while others yet staggered unsteadily upstairs. Oh, Tricia, my Tricia, your letter arrived at midday, and no sooner had I time to read it than I was called over to the school, which was perhaps just as well, because had I remained confined to my room, I would have gone mad. As it was, I took the stairs 3 at a time and raced, there was no other way to describe it, along the sun-drenched street to the bridge. Never before was the sky so intoxicatingly blue, the sun so magnificent and the air so sweet. The doves high up in the acacia trees in the convent gardens cooed as never before, and the view from the bridge made me dizzy, while at the same time I had to ask myself the obvious question: why me? Why should I in this world of misery and death be permitted such happiness? Later, on the training ground, my words spoken in Romanian seemed to flow by themselves, and even the most disinterested of officers appeared to be re-energized. That evening, on my way back to Lipova, I looked in the direction of Wangeritz and blew 1,000 kisses to you. The knowledge that you are happy and relaxed takes my breath away, and I have to literally pull myself together in case those around me start asking about my sanity, which I think they already do because my happiness is simply bursting out, just as it did when you said you would be my wife. Dearest, do you also feel that Traunstein has suddenly taken on a whole new meaning? Certainly Castle Pertenstein, the village of Fruling, the chapel of St. George, and the many walks around Ruhpolding had special memories, but now even the impersonal hotel and its room with the ghastly wallpaper has become dear to me. How I wish I could be with you to share in the joy which leaps out of your letter, which in and of itself was the best possible news. Your Willem. This happy outburst was in response to news that Patricia was expecting. Perhaps it was the extraordinary fine weather, or perhaps it was having finished the biography of von Zicht by General von Rabenau that propelled me out into the fresh air and towards the southern edge of town. It was a part of town filled with small houses and a crooked cobbled street that led out into the country. I had reached a hollow lane with banks of red clay on either side, which opened up into orchards and small gardens, and led to a place where 3 large wooden crosses had been erected. From there, I could look back over the rooftops, across the ridge, and into the barracks on the far side. The arrow-straight railway tracks disappeared into the distance, where the cottages in the village of Paulis were partially obscured by orchards and wineries. It was there where I was suddenly confronted by a man. "Over here, sir. Please come in. You are bringing news of our son, are you not?" With these words, an elderly man in work clothes hurried along the path and opened his garden gate. Although still in the grey of winter, it was a pretty garden encompassing a tiny whitewashed cottage and a lean-to stable. Before I could respond, he took hold of my sleeve and tugged me towards his house. "Hiller is my name. Hiller S. is my son from whom I am sure you are bringing news. He told me someone would come. Please come in." It gradually dawned on me what it was about. "I'm sorry, but there is a mistake. You must be thinking of someone else. I have no news of your son. I just came to look around." You mean you are not from Vienna? From my son? The old man's face crumpled in dismay, his Sunday shave accentuating the look of disappointment. His shoulders sagged. No, I am so sorry, but I'm not from Vienna. I am over at the NCO training school and am staying here in Lipova. The view over here is so attractive I just had to see for myself. Yes, our countryside is truly beautiful. So you are at the school? Yes, I have only been here a few weeks after having come from Germany. So you must have come via Vienna? Yes. Then you were close to my son. He is in hospital there and has written a few times and sent a couple of photos. Please come in. Let me show you. He eared me in through a low-slung doorway into a spotlessly clean living room. Mother, come down. We have a visitor, the old man called out. A chair was wiped clean, and although with not a speck of dust in sight, the table was wiped off again, and a pile of photographs spread out on its surface. With gnarled hands, the old man began to sort through them, showing pictures of a delightfully situated hospital, which must have been a large family house at one time. Pictures of a group of wounded soldiers in their unsightly zebra uniforms, the design of which has oddly been handed down from one generation to the next. Then there were photos of girls and women plying the men with flowers and cakes, and finally pictures of an excursion around Vienna, during which, no doubt, our man had taken his first steps following his hospital stay. The son was a young lad of 19 in a SS uniform, and, according to his father, announcement of his imminent convalescence leave should have already been received. Old man Hiller was a bricklayer by trade, and had worked on buildings in town, and even on our barracks. He insisted on showing me around his small property, following which he declared it was time to eat. His wife appeared and shook me by the hand before turning her attention to the stove. As if serving me food was the most natural thing in the world, Mutter placed a steaming bowl of milk soup before her husband and me. While we ate and chatted, a young girl entered the room. She was simply dressed, had an open face with blonde hair and blue eyes. Come, Crystal, say hello. This way I got to know the entire family other than the son who was somewhere in Vienna. As the meal came to an end, Frau Hiller sighed deeply. I wish this war was over. I am so afraid. What will happen when the Russians get here? The husband scoffed. Mutter, you don't know a thing. Look here, Herr Officer. I come in contact with so many Romanians, and I understand why they are fearful. Antonescu means well but has no support and no loyalty. But we Germans, we need have no fear. We have our Führer who succeeded in uniting some 80 or 90 million Germans behind him, as one man even to the last if necessary. Never has that happened before. And if the Führer was successful in carrying that off, then he will also succeed in leading Germany through this war. Look here, Herr Officer. And the old man shuffled through some old postcards. Here is a postcard from my son, and on it is written, The Führer knows only to battle, to work, and to care. We must lighten his burden as much as we can, but the rest we should leave to his GE, Nius, for he alone has a complete overview of all of the parts. That is why I say have no fear and just do our duty. Listening to the old man, my mind returned to the town of Belaja Gora on the banks of the fast-flowing river Donets. I thought of the magnificent line of hills on our side, the vast, intoxicatingly endless plain on the far side, and the beauty of it all was still so deeply etched in my mind, I knew I could never forget that country. Then I saw the grey, thin, pinched faces of my soldiers under steel helmets or fur hats, faces in which the eyes sometimes showed how their owner had seen death and had already moved beyond this world. In truth, many in their despair, nagging fear and acceptance of their likely fate, might understandably, in an unguarded moment, seek an easy way out. Yet they did their duty to the last, despite having been abandoned and betrayed as never before by their leadership. The old man opened the garden gate and invited me to return soon. His words were spoken with such earnest warmth that I was deeply moved, and felt the need to retreat to the cool darkness of the convent church, and sit there quietly before the weight of the world threatened to overwhelm me. I sent the following letter dated April 11th, 1944, to Patricia. My dear, dear girl, it is of course my longing for you that compels me to write again so soon. What are doing at this moment, I wonder? Are you upstairs in the children's room sitting on the couch? Or are you engaged in family activities around the round table in the salon? Or perhaps you are across the way having a chat with Ulla? Whatever you are doing, your man in Romania insists on writing letters full of love and the sincerest wishes that you are happy and have reason from time to have a good laugh. Thank you for your lines from Stettin with the doctor's encouraging report. Should it be a boy, I would like the name Michael, however. If it is a girl, I leave it up to you. I am sometimes overcome with guilt, knowing that amid all this indescribable misery and death, we have been given the wonderful gifts of a Mary and perhaps a Michael. Do you remember the morning of January 4th, 1939, when we stood on the platform of Victoria Street Station, already making plans which would have astounded my parents, let alone my grandmother? I wonder if our children will be just as wild and foolish. I expect they will. My dear Trix, you must not worry about me. I am doing quite well, and possibly as a result of the food and the warm climate, my attacks of dizziness have almost gone. I awake fresh each morning, ready to attack the world both physically and mentally, so much so that I'm unable to add more to my day, which begins at 6 a.m. with the sound of banging doors, followed by a face and the broad grin of my trusty Batman, and the muffled movement in the kitchen of a diminutive refugee lady called Berta. Once she opens the door and hands me a tray with my tea and 2 slices of dry white bread accompanied by a rosy cheek smile, I am wide awake. Can you imagine how good it feels to have such treatment after years of harsh front-line existence? Shortly before 7 a.m., I cross over from Lipova to the Radna side and am greeted by the sight of the castle on the hill and the convent church. Depending on what is planned for that day, I first go to my office and work at my desk, following which it is either off to the training grounds or a ride with Colonel Mardarescu out to the companies. Lunch is between 12:30 and 1 p.m., which we Germans eat as a group. This makes it easier because, unlike the Romanians, it is customary for us to share meals with our NCOs, which we find does much to improve communication and cooperation. After a short rest, I am usually in the good care of the interpreter Wagner, who does his best to teach me Romanian. Then it's back to the training grounds, and if horses are available, we take another ride between 6 and 8 p.m., at which time my thoughts are always with you. Finally, we have supper in a Lipova restaurant, but then the evening is sometimes too short to carry out my other pleasures, such as reading, writing my diary and letters, and learning the language. Every new day is a precious gift, and whenever I reflect on the source of my love of life, then I think back to the spring of 1938. Today, there is an intense feeling of being alive, which stems partially from the pleasure I get from my work, and partially from being transplanted among a delightfully cheerful people, whose endearing character, lively language, and fascinating countryside never fail to provide new wonders every day. That was exactly how I felt when visiting England for the first time. However, I never thought it possible that I should have the pleasure of repeating the experience. Now you know not to worry yourself, my lovely, dear, beautiful lass. Bill. The week of April 14th, 1944, served to shatter the peaceful image of a region yet largely untouched by the horror of war. Whether German, Romanian, or Hungarian, what we saw provided a terrifying preview of what was already happening in Bucharest and Kronstadt, a mere 100 kilometers away, and what threatened to transform our peaceful rural communities into ashes and rubble, from which only the bodies of the dead are recovered. It was early Monday when the adjutant went out to see for himself the columns of recently arrived refugees assembled in front of the monastery. The space under the venerable chestnut trees bore every trace of a temporary overnight encampment: scattered straw, punctured buckets, and piles of horse dung. With the sole exception of one solitary cart, the refugees themselves had all moved on. The scene brought back memories from my childhood, because it was the same kind of Panjay pony cart my parent had used in 1919 to travel to Tilsit. I almost thought I recognized the suspended buckets, the bundles and bedrolls upon which 2 women were seated. 2 tall, good-looking, fair-haired men were making the vehicle ready for departure. They were German settlers from the area around Odessa. A father, 2 sons, mother and daughter, all bound for the temporary safety of the Bachka. Sometime that morning, while on the training ground, which lay about 200 meters from the railway line, we observed a number of trains bound for Arad come into view. Through the open wagon doors and also on the roof lay and stood German soldiers in tattered, dirty winter uniforms. Deeply troubled, we looked around at our recruits, whose fresh young faces revealed nothing of their thoughts. Perhaps in their innocence they hadn't noticed. What did they think about the lead up to Stalingrad and the frightful destruction of the Sixth Army? Perhaps no more than the defeat of Napoleon's Grande Armée in 1813. Because the trains went no further, about 40 to 50 soldiers remained stranded at the station each day. However, finding accommodation and provisions for them had never been easier. In no time, the grey, emaciated figures were assigned quarters and formally escorted to their place of residence. And in a matter of just a few days with their hosts, the men, freshly washed, shaved and fed, made themselves ready for their continued journey, which appeared to have been to the Polish city of Krakow.